You've been lied to about loyalty. They told you it means never questioning, never wavering, always following orders no matter what. But here's the uncomfortable truth nobody wants to admit. Sometimes the most loyal thing you can do is betray everything you've been taught to believe. And in 1944, one German pilot proved that in the most spectacular way imaginable, by stealing his own country's most advanced secret fighter and handing it straight to America. Yeah, you heard that right. While everyone else was dying for flags and following orders, this guy looked at the most revolutionary aircraft of World War II, looked at the regime he was serving, and made a choice that would change war history forever. This isn't some Hollywood fiction, this is a true story that's more incredible than any screenplay, involving a Luftwaffe ace, a captured plane that was years ahead of its time, and a defection so bold it literally reshaped aviation technology for generations. Now, I know what you're thinking. Another WW2 documentary? I've seen a million of those. But hold on, because what you're about to discover isn't in most history books. See, this isn't about battles or strategy or the usual war narrative. This is about that moment, you know, the one I'm talking about, when everything you believe gets shattered and you have to choose between your conscience and your country, between what's comfortable and what's right, between surviving physically and surviving morally. This German pilot had it all: medals, respect, the trust of his commanders, a reputation as one of the best aviators in the Luftwaffe. And he threw it all away in one flight. One decision. One act that turned him into either a hero or a traitor depending on who's telling the story. The incredible part? That captured German aircraft he delivered, the jet fighter that wasn't supposed to exist yet, would influence every jet you see in the sky today. From military aviation to the commercial plane you flew on last vacation, the legacy of his choice is everywhere. So buckle up, because this true story of betrayal, courage, and impossible choices is about to take you on a flight you won't forget. Picture this. It's 1944, and the skies over Europe are painted with contrails and chaos. Down below, cities crumble, but up there, above the smoke and screams, there's a different kind of battle happening. And right in the thick of it, there's this German pilot, decorated with so many medals his chest looks like a jewelry store display. This guy wasn't just any Luftwaffe aviator. He was feared by Allied forces and absolutely revered by his own comrades. The kind of ace who could walk into a room and everyone would straighten up, you know? But here's the thing nobody talks about in war history books. Behind every victory lap, behind every confirmed kill painted on his aircraft's fuselage, there was something else growing inside him. A doubt. A whisper that got louder with every mission. Now, you've got to understand what it meant to be a top-tier pilot in the Luftwaffe during World War II. We're talking about flying some of the most advanced German aircraft of the time, engaging in dogfights that would make your heart stop, and carrying the weight of an entire nation's propaganda on your shoulders. This wasn't just about aviation skills, though he had those in spades. It was about being a symbol, a living, breathing recruitment poster for the Third Reich. Every time he landed after a successful mission, there'd be photographers waiting, officers congratulating him, and the regime's machinery ready to turn his exploits into front-page news. Think about that pressure for a second. You're good at what you do, maybe the best, but you're also being used as a tool for something way bigger and darker than yourself. The incredible story really begins with understanding who these pilots were as human beings, not just as warriors in the sky. See, most folks imagine WW2 German pilots as faceless enemies, right? But this ace, he had a family back home, dreams that had nothing to do with conquest, and a conscience that hadn't been completely buried by military indoctrination. Maybe he joined the Luftwaffe because he loved flying. What young man with gasoline in his veins wouldn't want to master those powerful machines? Or perhaps it was economic necessity, or family tradition, or just the momentum of a society marching toward catastrophe. Whatever the reason, by 1944, he'd seen enough to know that the glorious narrative he'd been fed was crumbling faster than the cities beneath his wings. The true story of his transformation starts right here, in this internal conflict. Every sortie became a moral battlefield as intense as the physical one. He'd climb into his cockpit, run through the pre-flight checks, fuel mixture, magnetos, instrument scan, and somewhere between engine start and wheels up, he'd wonder, what am I really fighting for? The other Allied pilots he'd faced weren't monsters. They were just guys like him, probably thinking the same thoughts. carrying the same fears. When you're that close to death every single day, when you've watched friends spiral down in flames, when you've pulled the trigger and watched another human being's story end in an explosion, it changes you. The propaganda becomes transparent. The lies become obvious. And suddenly, all those metals feel a whole lot heavier than brass and ribbon should feel. This wasn't about cowardice, by the way. This was about clarity cutting through the fog of war. Here's where it gets really interesting, and this is something they don't teach you in standard history classes. Throughout 1944, as the war turned increasingly desperate for Germany, the regime demanded more and more from its pilots. Longer missions, riskier engagements, impossible odds. The Luftwaffe was bleeding experienced aviators, and guys like our ace were being pushed beyond human limits to plug the gaps. But with each mission, with each close call, with each glimpse of the destruction they were perpetuating, something crystallized in his mind. He started paying attention to things he'd previously ignored, the targets they were hitting, the orders that didn't quite add up, the rumors about what was really happening in occupied territories. You know how sometimes you're so close to something you can't see it clearly? Then you take one step back and suddenly everything snaps into focus? That's what was happening to him. 30,000 feet above a continent tearing itself apart. The turning point, or maybe the beginning of the turning point, came during a mission that should have been routine. He was flying over territory he'd flown 100 times before, engaging enemy aircraft with the mechanical precision that had made him legendary. But this time something was different. Maybe it was the way the afternoon light caught the landscape below, or maybe it was just that his defenses were down for half a second. He really saw what the war was doing. Not to military targets or strategic positions, but to people, to families, to the fabric of civilization itself. And in that moment, thousands of feet above the earth, isolated in his cockpit with only the roar of the engine for company, he made a decision. Well, not a complete decision yet. More like the seed of one. The kind that burrows into your brain and grows whether you want it to or not. What makes this aviation story so compelling isn't just the aerial combat or the technical specs of the aircraft, though we'll get to those incredible machines soon enough. It's the human element, the psychological journey from true believer to questioner to someone contemplating the unthinkable. Our German pilot Ace wasn't plotting anything yet, wasn't making concrete plans, but he was watching now. Observing, cataloging, taking mental notes of things that might matter later, even if he wasn't quite sure what later meant. He started listening differently when officers briefed them on new equipment, on technological advances, on secret projects that were supposed to turn the tide of World War II. And when he heard whispers about a revolutionary new aircraft, something that didn't fly like anything anyone had ever seen before, his ears perked up, because maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of this nightmare that didn't end with him dead in a burning wreck or imprisoned by guilt for the rest of his life. So here's where the incredible story takes a turn that feels almost like science fiction. Except it's absolutely real. One morning in 1944, our German pilot gets summoned to a briefing unlike any he'd attended before. We're not talking about your standard tactical meeting with maps and weather reports. No, this was different. Higher security, fewer people, and an atmosphere so thick with secrecy you could cut it with a knife. The officers doing the briefing had that look in their eyes, you know the one? That mixture of pride and barely contained excitement. Like kids who just discovered their father's hidden present stash before Christmas. They started talking about a new aircraft, but the way they described it didn't match anything in the Luftwaffe's current arsenal. This wasn't an upgraded fighter or a tweaked bomber. This was something entirely revolutionary. A leap forward so significant it would make everything else in the sky look like antique toys. The word they kept using was jet. Jet fighter, jet propulsion, jet engine. Now, you've got to remember, this is 1944, and the entire world is still flying around with propeller-driven aircraft. The whole concept of aviation up to that point relied on props spinning fast enough to pull or push a plane through the air. But what these officers were describing defied everything our pilot thought he knew about how aircraft worked. Instead of propellers, the secret fighter used something called a turbojet engine that literally thrust the plane forward by shooting exhaust gases out the back at incredible speeds. Think about the first time you heard about smartphones if you'd only ever used rotary phones. That's the magnitude of the technological jump we're talking about here. And Germany had actually built it, while the rest of the world was still figuring out how to make their conventional aircraft go a little bit faster. The aircraft they were talking about was the Messerschmitt Me 262, and calling it advanced doesn't even begin to cover it. This German aircraft could reach speeds that would make Allied pilots think they were seeing things. We're talking about 540 miles per hour when most fighters topped out around 400 or less. Imagine you're driving on a highway doing 65, and someone blows past you doing 90. You barely see them, right? That's what Allied pilots experienced when they encountered these jet fighters. Our ace listened to the specifications with a mixture of professional curiosity and that growing awareness we talked about earlier. For 30mm cannons, swept-wing design for high-speed stability, and a rate of climb that was frankly absurd. But here's what really got him. They wanted him to test it, to be one of the select few trusted enough to evaluate this weapon that could potentially change the course of World War II. Getting selected for this assignment was both an honor and a revelation. See, the regime only trusted its most loyal, most proven pilots with this kind of secret project. The fact that they chose him meant his outward performance had been flawless. His doubts were still safely hidden beneath a mask of duty and competence. But now he had access to something bigger than he'd ever imagined. When he first saw the Me 262 sitting on the tarmac, it literally took his breath away. The aircraft looked alien compared to everything else around it. Sleek, aggressive, purposeful, with those distinctive engine nacelles slung under the wings like nothing else flying. It was beautiful in the way that powerful things often are, regardless of their intended purpose. You could appreciate a sword's craftsmanship even while recognizing it's made for killing, you know? That's what he felt looking at this jet fighter, this pinnacle of German engineering and innovation. The first test flight changed everything, and I mean everything. Strapping into that cockpit felt different from his usual aircraft. The instruments were similar but not identical, and the pre-flight checklist had items he'd never dealt with before. Turbine temperatures, fuel consumption rates that would drain tanks in under an hour, handling characteristics that the briefing officers had warned would feel unusual at first. Unusual. That was putting it mildly. When he fired up those jet engines, the sound wasn't the familiar rumble of a piston engine. It was a high-pitched whine that built into a roar, like the sky itself was screaming. And the acceleration? Absolutely insane. He'd gone from standstill to flying speed in what felt like seconds, the aircraft leaping off the runway with an eagerness that was almost violent. Once airborne, he pushed the throttle forward and felt the kind of acceleration that pressed him back into his seat. The landscape below blurring as the airspeed indicator climbed past numbers he'd only dreamed about. Up there, alone in that secret fighter above the clouds, something clicked into place in our pilot's mind. This wasn't just an aircraft, this was leverage. This was the kind of technological advantage that nations would kill for, literally. The Allies had nothing like this, and if Germany could produce these jet fighters in enough numbers, it really might extend the war, cause countless more deaths, prolong the agony of a conflict that any rational person could see Germany was going to lose anyway. But here's the thing. What if this incredible aviation technology ended up in different hands? What if someone could prevent it from being used to extend a lost cause and instead ensure it contributed to ending the war faster? These thoughts were dangerous, the kind that could get a man executed for treason before he finished speaking them out loud. So he kept them locked tight, maintained his professional demeanor, filed his test reports with appropriate enthusiasm, and all the while, that seed we talked about, it was growing into something much bigger. Every subsequent test flight with the Me 262 reinforced both the aircraft's capabilities and his growing conviction that something had to be done. He learned its quirks. The engines were temperamental, required careful throttle management, and had a nasty habit of flaming out if you weren't gentle with them. He mastered the high-speed handling, the way it wanted to fly fast and got cranky when you slowed it down too much. He memorized every gauge, every switch, every procedure until he could fly the thing in his sleep. And with each flight, with each moment spent piloting this secret weapon, he thought about what it represented. The incredible story of German engineering excellence, sure, but also the incredible waste of talent and resources being poured into destruction when they could have been building something better. The other test pilots noticed he'd gotten quiet, more contemplative, but they probably chalked it up to the intensity of the work. Nobody suspected that he was already beginning to formulate a plan so audacious, so dangerous, that even thinking about it made his hands shake sometimes when he was alone. There's this moment that happens to people sometimes, maybe you've experienced it yourself, where everything you've been suppressing, every doubt you've pushed down, every uncomfortable truth you've avoided, suddenly comes rushing up all at once like a dam breaking. For our German pilot, that moment arrived not during a dramatic battle or a close call with death, but during something much quieter and somehow more devastating. He was walking through a town near the airfield, just trying to clear his head after another test flight in the secret fighter, when he saw them. Refugees streaming past, their faces hollow with that particular kind of exhaustion that comes from losing everything. Old people who could barely walk, children with dirt-streaked faces clutching broken toys, mothers carrying babies and somehow also carrying the weight of impossible choices. And right then, something inside him just shattered. Because he'd been one of the people making this happen, hadn't he? Every mission he'd flown, every order he'd followed, every time he'd chosen not to question. He'd been part of the machinery creating this misery. The horrors he'd seen during World War II weren't abstract anymore, weren't just tactical realities or unfortunate necessities of war. They were real people, real suffering, real consequences of the regime he'd been serving with such distinction. You know how sometimes you can know something intellectually but not really feel it? That's where he'd been for years. Aware but insulated. Informed but emotionally disconnected. But standing there on that street in 1944, watching humanity at its most broken shuffle past him, the insulation evaporated completely. He thought about cities he'd flown over that weren't there anymore, just rubble and dust. He thought about enemy pilots he'd shot down who probably had families waiting for them, who probably had doubts just like his. He thought about his own comrades who'd bought into the propaganda so completely they couldn't see what was right in front of them. And he thought about the lies. Oh man, the lies he'd told himself to keep functioning, to keep flying, to keep being the ace everyone expected him to be. Here's what nobody tells you about being caught between loyalty and conscience. It's not a clean choice, not a simple decision between obvious good and obvious evil. It's messy and complicated and it tears you apart from the inside. Our pilot loved his country. Not the Nazi regime, but the actual place, the culture, the people, the landscape he'd grown up in. He had friends in the Luftwaffe, good men who weren't monsters, just soldiers doing what they thought was right, or at least doing what they'd been trained to do. His family was still there, still living under a government that didn't take kindly to defectors or traitors. If he acted on what his conscience was screaming at him to do, he'd be branded a traitor. His family would be disgraced or worse, and everyone he'd ever served with would curse his name. But if he didn't act, if he kept flying and testing and pretending everything was fine, he'd have to live with himself afterward, assuming there was an afterward. That's the impossible choice. Betraying everyone around you, or betraying yourself. The war history books make these decisions sound straightforward, like people just wake up one day and decide to switch sides, easy as changing your shirt. But the truth is so much harder and more painful. Every night, our ace would lie awake running scenarios in his head. What if he just flew the Me-262 until the war ended and Germany lost, which seemed increasingly inevitable, and then claimed he was just following orders? Lots of people would do that, and some would probably get away with it. Or what if he tried to subtly sabotage things from the inside, fly badly enough to fail the tests without being obvious about it? But no, they'd just replace him with someone else, and the jet fighter program would continue without him. Or, and this is the thought that kept coming back, the one he couldn't shake no matter how hard he tried. What if he did something so dramatic, so definitive, that it couldn't be undone or ignored? What if he took that incredible aircraft, that secret weapon, and delivered it straight into enemy hands? The plan started forming despite his fear, or maybe because of it. He'd be flying the Me-262 anyway as part of his test duties, so getting into the cockpit wouldn't raise suspicions. The German aircraft had the range to reach Allied territory if he flew smart and didn't waste fuel on unnecessary maneuvers. He knew the general locations of Allied bases from intelligence briefings. Ironic, right? The Luftwaffe had literally given him the information he'd need to defect. But this wasn't just about running away or surrendering to save his own skin. This was about delivering something valuable, something that could genuinely help end the war faster. The Americans would absolutely want to get their hands on this jet fighter technology. It was years ahead of anything they had, and understanding it could give them insights into aviation advances that might save Allied lives. That's how he justified it to himself anyway. Not as betrayal, but as a way to actually do something good. Something that mattered. Something that might balance the scales just a tiny bit. But justification and action are two very different things, and the gap between them was filled with pure terror. Every time he came close to committing to the plan, his mind would flood with images of what failure would mean. Capture before takeoff meant execution. No trial, no mercy, just a bullet and an unmarked grave. Getting shot down during the attempt meant death anyway, just with more explosions involved. Successfully reaching Allied territory didn't even guarantee safety. Jumpy anti-aircraft gunners might blow him out of the sky before he could communicate his intentions, or Allied fighters might engage him thinking he was attacking. And even if everything went perfectly, even if he somehow made it to America alive with the aircraft intact, he'd spend the rest of his life knowing he'd turned his back on everyone he'd ever known. His name would be synonymous with treachery in Germany. His family would suffer. His former friends would spit at the mention of him. Was he really strong enough to carry that weight? The breaking point, the real one, not just the emotional crisis but the moment of actual decision, came during a conversation with a fellow pilot who was spouting propaganda like a broken radio. This guy was going on and about how the jet fighter would turn the tide, how Germany would still win, how their enemies would tremble before their technological superiority, all that delusional nonsense. And our ace just looked at him and realized, this is what I'll become if I stay. Either a true believer in a lost cause, or a cynic going through the motions while the world burns. Neither option was acceptable anymore. He'd seen too much, knew too much, and had access to something too important to just let it play out. The true story of who he was, not the propaganda version, not the ace of the Reich, but the actual human being underneath all those medals, demanded action. So right there, listening to his comrade's fantasy about German victory, he made the decision. He was going to do it. He was going to steal the most advanced aircraft in the world and hand it over to America. The only questions left were when and how. Once you've made a decision that big, that irreversible, everything else becomes almost mechanical, like your body just goes into autopilot while your mind watches from somewhere far away. Our German pilot spent the next several days in this weird state of hyper-awareness mixed with complete calm. He couldn't tell anyone what he was planning, obviously, so he went through his regular routines with extra precision. Morning briefings, test flights in the Me-262, technical debriefs, meals with fellow pilots where he smiled and nodded at all the right moments. But inside, he was planning every detail of what would be the most important flight of his life. He studied weather patterns, memorized flight paths, calculated fuel consumption down to the last drop, and identified which Allied-controlled airfields in Western Europe would be closest and most likely to let him land without shooting him down first. The incredible story of his defection would hinge on preparation and timing. One mistake, one overlooked detail, and the whole thing would end in disaster. The day he chose wasn't particularly special, actually, that was the whole point. He needed a day that seemed routine, that wouldn't raise suspicions, when his flight schedule had him testing the secret fighter anyway. It was a gray morning in 1944, the kind where low clouds hung over the airfield like a blanket and visibility was decent but not great. Perfect, actually. The weather would provide some cover without being so bad that it would ground him or make navigation impossible. He went through his pre-flight routine exactly as he always did, checking the aircraft's exterior, inspecting the jet engines, reviewing the fuel load. Other personnel were around, mechanics and officers, and he chatted with them casually about technical specifications and expected performance parameters. Nobody suspected a thing because why would they? He was their ace, their trusted test pilot, the guy who'd proven his loyalty 100 times over. The irony was almost painful. Their complete trust in him was what made his betrayal possible. Strapping into that cockpit felt different this time, and he had to consciously keep his hands from shaking as he ran through the startup checklist. Every switch he flipped, every gauge he checked might be the last time he'd do it as a Luftwaffe pilot. Once those jet engines spooled up and he pointed this German aircraft toward Allied territory, there'd be no coming back, no changing his mind, no pretending it was all a misunderstanding. He'd be a defector, plain and simple. The tower cleared him for takeoff, routine, casual, just another test flight, and he acknowledged with the same calm professionalism he always used. Throttle forward, That distinctive jet whine building to a roar, acceleration pressing him back, and then wheels up. Just like that, he was airborne. To anyone watching from the ground, it looked like every other test flight he'd done. But he knew, and the knowledge made his heart pound so hard he could feel it in his throat, that he was never coming back to this airfield. The first few minutes were the most dangerous in a different way than he'd expected. See, he had to fly the initial part of the mission exactly as planned, exactly as his flight schedule indicated, or someone might notice the deviation and scramble fighters to intercept him. So he climbed to altitude, performed a few of the maneuvers he was supposed to be testing, and generally acted like everything was normal. But every second felt like an hour, and he kept waiting for the radio to crackle with orders to return to base, for warning signs that someone had figured it out. Nothing came. Just silence and the roar of the Mi-262's engines as he pushed further from German-controlled territory. Then, at the point where he'd normally bank around and head back, he just didn't. He kept the nose pointed west, toward Allied lines, toward freedom, toward America, or at least toward American forces in Europe. This was it. The moment of no return. He was really doing this. The World War II aviation landscape was about to change, and he was the one changing it. Flying toward enemy territory in one of the most distinctive aircraft ever built was probably one of the most terrifying things a person could do, and our pilot was discovering that in real time. Every shadow on the ground could be anti-aircraft batteries. Every speck in the sky could be Allied fighters scrambling to intercept what they'd assume was an attack. He'd prepared a few phrases in English. Not great English, mind you, but enough to hopefully communicate his intentions over the radio before someone shot him down. The problem was he didn't know what frequencies the Americans monitored, and broadcasting on the wrong one could alert the Luftwaffe to what he was doing before he got far enough away. So he flew in radio silence for a while, just pushing west, burning through fuel at a rate that made him constantly recalculate whether he'd actually make it. The jet fighter was fast, incredibly fast, but it was also incredibly thirsty, and range wasn't exactly its strong suit. Every minute that ticked by was a minute closer to either safety or flaming wreckage. Then he saw them, Allied fighters, probably American P-47s or P-51s, rising to intercept him. His stomach dropped because this was the moment where everything could go wrong in an instant. They'd see this German aircraft, this jet fighter that looked like nothing they'd ever encountered, screaming through their airspace, and their first instinct would be to shoot. He had seconds to make himself understood. He switched to what he hoped was an American frequency and started broadcasting, his accented English probably barely comprehensible. American pilots, I am defector, I am German pilot defecting, do not shoot, I have important aircraft, I am landing, do not shoot. He repeated it over and over, not knowing if anyone could even hear him, watching those Allied fighters close in. They could end him right now, could blow this captured plane, well, soon to be captured plane, right out of the sky. He thought about everything that had led to this moment, all the choices and doubts and horrors and hopes, and realized that his fate was completely out of his hands now. Miraculously, they didn't fire. Maybe they heard his broadcast, or maybe they were just curious about this weird aircraft that looked like nothing they'd seen before, or maybe someone in command made a split-second decision to investigate rather than destroy. The Allied fighters flanked him, close enough that he could see the pilots' faces through their canopies, and started gesturing for him to follow them. Relief flooded through him so intensely he felt lightheaded. They were escorting him, not attacking him. He followed their lead as they guided him toward an airfield. He'd later learn it was an American airbase, and the whole way down he kept thinking, I'm actually going to make it. Against all odds, through all the danger and fear and impossible choices, he was actually going to deliver this secret fighter to America. The landing was rough, he was shaking so badly he could barely control the aircraft properly, but he got the Mi-262 on the ground intact. When he finally shut down those jet engines and popped the canopy, there were dozens of American soldiers surrounding the aircraft, weapons drawn but also with expressions of absolute amazement on their faces. He raised his hands, climbed out slowly, and in that moment stopped being a Luftwaffe ace and became something entirely different. The defector who changed war history. So there he stood on American soil, well, Allied-controlled European soil, but you get the point, surrounded by soldiers who couldn't quite believe what they were looking at. Think about it from their perspective for a second. You're a regular GI stationed at an airbase, probably bored out of your mind doing routine security checks, and suddenly this aircraft that looks like it flew straight out of a science fiction magazine lands on your runway. And out steps a Luftwaffe pilot, hands up, trying to explain in broken English that he's just handed you the most advanced piece of aviation technology in the world. The American intelligence officers who arrived within hours couldn't contain their excitement. They were like kids on Christmas morning, except their present was a jet fighter that represented a technological leap nobody in the Allied forces had anticipated. The debriefing started immediately, and our defector found himself answering question after question about the Me-262, about German aircraft development programs, about everything he knew. What began as an act of conscience was rapidly becoming something much bigger. One of the greatest intelligence coups of World War II. The true story of what happened next involves a lot of technical analysis, engineering assessments, and high-level military discussions that would bore you to tears if I went into all the details. But here's what matters. American aviation experts literally took that secret fighter apart piece by piece, studying every component, every design choice, every innovation that made it so superior to conventional aircraft. They brought in the best minds in aeronautical engineering, guys who'd been working on America's own jet programs but were years behind what Germany had already achieved. Those engineers crawled all over the Me-262, measuring, photographing, testing, trying to understand how the Germans had solved problems that American designers were still struggling with. The swept-wing design, the engine nacelle placement, the high-speed aerodynamics, all of it was gold, pure intelligence gold. And it all came from one pilot's decision to follow his conscience instead of his orders. Pretty incredible when you think about it, right? But the legacy wasn't just about the hardware, as important as that was. See, our German pilot brought something even more valuable than the aircraft itself. He brought knowledge, experience, and insight into how the Luftwaffe operated, how they thought, what their capabilities and limitations were. During his debriefings, which went on for weeks, he provided details about German aircraft production, about pilot training programs, about morale issues within the Luftwaffe, about strategic thinking at command levels. This was the kind of intelligence that couldn't be gathered from aerial reconnaissance or intercepted communications. This was insider information from a decorated ace who'd been at the heart of Germany's most secret aviation programs. Military historians would later say that the information he provided helped shorten the war, helped save lives by giving Allied commanders a clearer picture of what they were facing and what advantages they could exploit. That's a heavy legacy to carry, and our defector would spend years processing what it all meant. The impact on post-war aviation was absolutely massive, and this is where the incredible story really extends beyond World War II into the decades that followed. American jet fighter programs accelerated dramatically after engineers had the chance to study the Me-262. Design principles that German engineers had pioneered, things like engine placement, wing geometry for high-speed flight, cockpit layouts optimized for jet performance. All of this influenced the next generation of American aircraft. Look at jets like the F-86 Sabre that dominated the Korean War skies in the early 1950s, and you can see the lineage, the DNA of that captured plane that our pilot delivered in 1944. The Soviets also got their hands on Me-262 technology, different story, different defectors and captured aircraft, and it influenced their MiG designs too. Basically, that one act of defection rippled out through aviation history, shaping the jet age that would define modern air combat and eventually even commercial air travel. Now, here's where it gets personally complicated for our defector, because legacy isn't just about technological impact or historical significance. It's also about how you're remembered and how you live with what you've done. In Allied countries, especially America, he was initially treated as a hero, a brave soul who'd risked everything to do the right thing. Intelligence agencies paraded him around a bit, used his story for propaganda purposes to encourage other defections and demoralize the enemy. But as the years went by and he tried to build a new life, the reality of what he'd done settled in. He couldn't go home. Germany, even after the war ended, wasn't safe for him. His family had been interrogated, possibly worse, because of his defection. Former comrades who survived the war considered him a traitor, and in some circles, his name was spoken with hatred. The moral clarity of his decision, doing the right thing even when it cost him everything, didn't make the consequences any easier to live with. War history loves clean narratives. Heroes and villains, good guys and bad guys, right and wrong. But the true story of this defector exists in all the messy gray areas in between. Was he a hero? Absolutely, He potentially saved countless lives and advanced human knowledge in aviation technology. Was he a traitor? Also, absolutely. He violated his oath, abandoned his comrades, and gave away his nation's most closely guarded secrets. Can both things be true at the same time? That's the question that defines his legacy and maybe teaches us something important about moral courage in impossible situations. He made the choice that let him live with himself afterward, that aligned his actions with his conscience, even knowing it would cost him everything he'd known before. And decades later, when historians and aviation enthusiasts tell this incredible story of the German pilot who gave America his secret fighter, they're really telling a story about what it means to choose principle over loyalty, future over past, conscience over comfort. The legacy lives on in unexpected ways even today. Every time you board a commercial jet, you're benefiting from technology that traces its lineage back through decades of aviation development that was accelerated by studying captured German aircraft like the Me-262. Every time military historians analyze World War II, they include his defection as a turning point, a moment when intelligence gathering and technological acquisition changed the strategic landscape. And every time someone faces an impossible choice between loyalty and conscience, between what's expected and what's right, between the safe path and the moral one, well, they're walking the same ground our defector walked in 1944. His legacy isn't just about airplanes or war or even history in the traditional sense. It's about the courage to stand alone, to risk everything, to say no more, when everyone around you is saying, keep going. That's the kind of legacy that transcends time, that speaks to something fundamental in the human experience, that reminds us we always have a choice even when it feels like we don't. So what are you going to do with this knowledge? Because here's the thing, this isn't just some dusty war history tale about events that happened 80 years ago. This is about you right now in whatever situation you're facing. Maybe you're not flying a jet fighter or making decisions that affect the course of nations, but I guarantee you've got choices in front of you where doing the right thing costs something. Where standing up means standing alone. Where your conscience is whispering one thing and everyone around you is shouting another. The question is, are you brave enough to listen to that whisper? Are you willing to pay the price for living according to your principles? Our German pilot lost everything. His country, his reputation, his past. But he gained something nobody could take away. The ability to look himself in the mirror. What would you be willing to sacrifice to say the same? I want you to really think about that, because this incredible true story isn't just entertainment. It's a challenge. It's asking you, when your moment comes, when you're at your breaking point, when you have the chance to do something that matters even if it costs you everything, what will you choose? Drop a comment below and tell me. What's one situation in your life right now where you know what's right but you're scared to do it? Let's talk about it. And hey, if the story moved you, if it made you think, if it reminded you that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they choose courage over comfort, smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell. Because there are more stories like this, more lessons from history that'll challenge you to be better, to do better, to choose better. Don't just watch this and move on. Let it change something in you. That's how legacies really work, when they inspire action in others, when they ripple forward through time. Be part of that ripple. Subscribe, stay connected, and let's keep learning how to live with courage together.